Introduction and our interconnected nature. We live in an era that is uniquely obsessed with wellness, yet paradoxically, our collective well-being is steadily unraveling. Massive industries thrive on our relentless pursuit of longevity, vitality, and emotional balance, selling us endless diets, specialized regimens, and the latest breakthroughs in self-improvement. Despite this unprecedented investment of time, money, and emotional energy, the overall picture of human health is growing increasingly bleak. At the very height of medical advancement, we are witnessing a surging tide of chronic physical ailments alongside escalating rates of psychological distress and substance dependency. What makes this predicament even more striking is our general lack of alarm. We have grown accustomed to a reality that should disturb us, treating widespread illness not as a profound mystery to be solved, but as an expected feature of modern existence. Behind this epidemic of suffering lies a fundamental flaw in the fabric of our society. The afflictions we face are not mere biological glitches or random strokes of misfortune. They are deeply intertwined with the social, emotional, and economic environments we inhabit. To understand this, we must expand our definition of a toxic environment. It is not merely the chemical pollutants in our air or the microplastics in our oceans, nor is it simply the polarizing hostility of modern discourse. The toxicity runs deeper, embedded in the very values, assumptions, and structures that dictate how we live. Our economic systems and societal norms generate chronic, unrelenting pressures that erode human flourishing. Consider a scientific laboratory where a biological culture is prepared in a petri dish. If the environment is formulated correctly, the organisms within it will thrive. If those same organisms begin to perish or mutate at alarming rates, the logical conclusion is that the culture itself is contaminated or fundamentally unsuited to sustain life. Human societies operate on the same principle. When staggering portions of the population require daily medication, when rates of autoimmune conditions and early-onset cancers rise disproportionately, when obesity and metabolic disorders sweep across the globe, and when an entire generation of youth reports crippling anxiety and despair about the future, the societal culture is clearly hostile to the organisms it is meant to nurture. Yet, we have normalized this hostility. Like fish swimming in water, oblivious to the medium that surrounds them, we are largely blind to the ubiquitous realities of our daily existence. We accept a definition of what is typical that is, in truth, profoundly unnatural. To meet the standard criteria for a successful, well-adjusted life in the modern world often requires us to conform to demands that violate our innate human needs. Consequently, the ailments of our bodies and minds should not be viewed as isolated pathologies, but rather as desperate alarm bells ringing out against an unnatural way of living. Unfortunately, mainstream medical practice often misses this vital connection. By dissecting the human experience into purely biological components and artificially separating the mind from the body, modern healthcare treats symptoms without addressing the underlying conditions that gave rise to them. While medical science has achieved miraculous victories over acute threats like infectious diseases, it struggles to manage the rising tide of chronic conditions because it ignores the broader context of patients' lives. A true shift toward global wellness requires us to look beyond the microscope and recognize that every individual's health is the culmination of their experiences, relationships, and societal pressures. The journey toward understanding this interconnectedness begins at the foundational layer of human experience, the concept of the psychic wound. Consider a deeply disproportionate emotional reaction to a minor inconvenience. An accomplished aging professional returns home from a successful trip, only to receive a brief message that his spouse has been delayed. Instead of responding with rational understanding, he descends into a state of profound hostility, shutting down communication and radiating bitter resentment. This reaction belongs not to a mature adult, but to a terrified infant suspended in a physiological time warp. It is the footprint of early childhood suffering, a silent dictator that hijacks the present moment. This is the essence of trauma. It is vital to recognize that the wound is not the external event that occurred. Rather, it is the internal injury that remains. Like a concussion following a collision, the impact happens in an instant, but the damage endures. When an emotional injury fails to heal, it either remains an open, hypersensitive sore or it hardens into rigid scar tissue, limiting flexibility and growth. Whether raw or scarred, this unresolved internal rupture dictates our behaviors, poisons our self-perception, and restricts our relationships, often without our conscious awareness. We often mistakenly reserve this concept for victims of catastrophic abuse or war. In reality, it operates on a broad spectrum and is practically universal in our society. There are profound, overwhelming experiences that shatter a vulnerable person's safety, leading to severe mental and physical health consequences. But there are also the quieter, more pervasive wounds inflicted by the absence of essential nurturing, the pain of a child whose emotional needs for profound connection simply go unmet. Both forms result in a tragic fragmentation of the self. It is crucial to distinguish enduring internal wounds from mere stress. Many life events are stressful, distressing, or deeply upsetting, but they only leave a lasting traumatic imprint if they permanently diminish our capacity to experience the world. If an experience chronically constricts your ability to trust, limits your emotional flexibility, or leaves you trapped in compulsive patterns of self-soothing, it has left a permanent scar. One of the most profound consequences of this internal scarring is a forced separation from one's own physical body. When the physical or emotional environment becomes unbearably painful, and neither fighting back nor running away is a viable option for a helpless child, the only remaining defense is to mentally vacate the premises. The mind tunes out the unbearable sensations, severing the vital connection to physical awareness. This survival mechanism, while life-saving in the moment, becomes a chronic estrangement. People may spend decades entirely disconnected from their own physical sensations, unable to recognize their own pain or exhaustion until it manifests as severe illness. Similarly, this protective numbness extends to our gut feelings and natural instincts. Our primary emotions evolved as vital messengers, alerting us to danger and guiding our survival. When expressing these emotions poses a threat to a child's precarious safety, the feelings must be banished from conscious awareness. The individual becomes emotionally hollowed out, trapped in a state of chronic suppression that leaves them vulnerable to boundary violations and unable to defend themselves in adulthood. This deep-seated suppression robs us of our freedom to choose how we respond to the world. Instead of pausing to evaluate a situation and selecting a considered action, the wounded nervous system reacts with rigid, automatic defensiveness. The ability to navigate life's inevitable disappointments with grace and flexibility is heavily impaired, replaced by reflexive patterns programmed long ago. Furthermore, these internal ruptures inevitably breed a profound, often unconscious sense of shame. When a child cannot safely process their natural anger or distress, those emotions turn inward, transforming into a toxic belief that they are fundamentally deficient. This self-loathing can manifest as crushing depression, or it can masquerade as its exact opposite, a desperate, grandiose striving for perfection and external validation. In our culture, the chronic belief of inadequacy fuels countless exhausting careers and stands as a major contributor to physical exhaustion and disease. This fragmented state not only distorts how we view ourselves, but also how we perceive reality. The world we believe in becomes the world we inhabit. If early experiences teach us that the environment is inherently hostile or untrustworthy, we will inevitably adopt a defensive, cynical posture, continuously recreating the very dynamics we fear. Alternatively, we might retreat into a frantic state of distraction. Modern consumer culture brilliantly exploits this need to escape the present moment, offering an endless buffet of entertainment, digital stimulation, and compulsive busyness. We become terrified of stillness, constantly consuming technologies only to desperately kill the time we have saved, fleeing from the quiet space where our unresolved pain resides. Tragically, these unhealed wounds rarely end with the individual. They echo across generations. Parents unconsciously transmit the unresolved burdens of their own histories to their children, creating environments that subtly replicate the emotional deprivations they once suffered. Yet, understanding this chain of transmission should not lead to blame or self-condemnation. Blame is an entirely useless construct when examining an unbroken chain of suffering stretching back through history. Instead, recognizing that our limitations are internal injuries, rather than permanent external curses or inherent character flaws, grants us the power of agency. What was broken within us can be repaired. By bravely examining the invisible forces that shape our reactions, we open the door to profound healing and the reclamation of our authentic selves. The boundaries that separate our internal biology from the external world are, in many ways, an illusion. For centuries, a mechanistic view of human life has dominated, treating the body as an isolated vehicle driven by an independent mind, operating entirely distinct from its environment. Yet modern scientific revelation paints a radically different, deeply intertwined picture. Our very cellular machinery, the expression of our genetics, and the architecture of our brains are continuously sculpted by our social and emotional atmospheres. DNA is not a fixed, inescapable destiny. Rather, it resembles a vast, silent keyboard. Our life experiences, particularly the emotional climates of our earliest years and the chronic stresses of our daily existence, act as the invisible hands playing the keys. This dynamic interplay means we literally metabolize our surroundings. The warmth of human connection, the subtle hostilities of a toxic workplace, the unspoken anxieties of our parents, all are translated into physiological data, altering hormonal tides and immune responses. We do not simply live in our environments live within us, weaving the invisible threads of our relationships into the physical fabric of our nervous systems. This profound permeability of human life becomes tragically evident when we confront the escalating crisis of the body turning against itself. The immune system is a magnificent, highly intelligent defense network, evolved over millennia to perform one critical task: distinguishing self from non-self. It must ruthlessly eliminate foreign invaders while protecting native tissue. However, when an individual is subjected to a lifetime of suppressed emotions, toxic relationships, and relentless environmental pressure, this inner intelligence becomes profoundly disoriented. The emotional boundaries of the person become blurred by the constant need to adapt to external demands, and mirroring this, the physiological boundaries lose their clarity. The body begins to attack its own joints, its own nervous system, its own organs. It is hardly a coincidence that these devastating autoimmune conditions disproportionately afflict those who are culturally conditioned to silence their own distress, most often women, who bear the invisible, exhausting weight of managing the emotional equilibrium of those around them. When the conscious mind is forbidden from expressing a necessary no to excessive demands, the body assumes the burden, staging a desperate, inflammatory mutiny to force a halt. To fully grasp the magnitude of this inner rebellion, we must radically shift our perception of what an illness actually is. We have been conditioned to view disease as a malevolent, autonomous entity, a sudden intruder that breaches the fortress of the body. We speak of catching a disease or fighting it, turning it into a static noun. But illness is not a fixed thing. It is a verb. It is a dynamic, unfolding process that represents the culmination of a lifetime of adaptations. A diagnosis is merely a snapshot of a moving picture, the physiological manifestation of an individual's unique biography. By labeling an affliction as an isolated thing, we violently strip away the rich, complex context of the person experiencing it. We ignore the years of chronic stress, the unresolved psychic wounds, and the societal pressures that laid the groundwork for the physical collapse. Physical symptoms are rarely random strokes of misfortune. They are the final, desperate language of an organism that has been pushed far beyond its natural capacity to endure unnatural ways of living. The seeds of this lifelong process of adaptation and eventual exhaustion are sown in the earliest, most desperate negotiations of childhood. At the very core of human development lies a tragic, unavoidable tension between two absolute biological imperatives: the need for attachment and the drive for authenticity. As vulnerable, helpless infants, our survival depends entirely on maintaining a secure, nurturing connection with our primary caregivers. Attachment is not merely a psychological preference, it is our lifeline, as critical to our continued existence as oxygen or sustenance. Without it, the infant perishes. Yet we are also born with a fierce, innate drive for authenticity. We possess a deep-seated need to feel our own visceral feelings, to honor our bodily instincts, and to express our true nature without distortion. Authenticity is the compass that guides a creature safely through the world, signaling what is nourishing and what is dangerous. In a truly supportive environment, a child can maintain their vital attachment to their parents while freely expressing their authentic joy, anger, and sorrow. However, when these two fundamental needs collide, a quiet tragedy ensues. If an environment, driven by stressed, overwhelmed, or culturally conditioned parents, implicitly demands that a child suppress their true emotions to remain acceptable, the child faces an impossible, terrifying dilemma. If crying, displaying anger, or exhibiting exuberance threatens to alienate the caregiver, the child must choose between being true to themselves or securing the love they need to survive. Invariably, the biological drive for survival wins. The child will unconsciously yet ruthlessly sever the connection to their own inner compass. They will swallow their anger, numb their sadness, and silence their authenticity to secure the fragile attachment. This profound self-abandonment is the original, invisible fracture in human development. It guarantees physical survival in the short term, but it establishes a devastating, lifelong pattern. The individual learns that safety requires prioritizing external expectations over internal reality. Decades later, this chronic, suffocating disconnection from the authentic self serves as the fertile, unyielding soil from which both psychological despair and physiological disease inevitably grow. To comprehend the profound crisis of well-being that plagues modern society, we must first dare to ask a fundamental question. What is the true nature of our species? We are bombarded with a prevailing cultural narrative that insists human beings are inherently selfish, aggressively competitive, and solitary by design. This cynical view of human nature is incredibly convenient, as it perfectly justifies the harsh, individualistic economic and social structures that define our current era. If we are biologically programmed for ruthless competition, then a society characterized by massive inequality, chronic stress, and isolation is simply the natural order of things, a reflection of our genetic destiny. However, a closer examination of our evolutionary history reveals a starkly different reality. For the vast majority of human existence, our ancestors lived in small, fiercely egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands. In these communities, survival did not depend on stepping over one another to reach the top of a hierarchy. It depended entirely on cooperation, intense mutual support, and profound social cohesion. The human nervous system evolved to expect and require this deeply interconnected environment. We are, at our core, a species wired for empathy, communal care, and shared responsibility. The aggressive, self-serving behaviors we so often witness today are not the inevitable expressions of our DNA, but rather tragic distortions. They are the predictable adaptations of a cooperative species forced to navigate a profoundly unnatural, hyper-competitive environment. When our intrinsic need for belonging and mutual care is thwarted, human nature does not disappear. It becomes warped, manifesting in the very greed, hostility, and despair that our culture mistakenly labels as inherent. Because our evolutionary history was shaped by deep communal living, human infants enter the world with a specific set of biological expectations. A child is not a blank slate, nor a resilient lump of clay that can be molded to fit any environment without consequence. Instead, children are born with a rigid set of irreducible needs, foundational requirements that must be met if they are to develop into healthy, emotionally regulated adults. Just as a plant requires a specific balance of sunlight, water, and soil nutrients to flourish, a developing human brain requires a specific emotional and relational atmosphere. Primary among these needs is the presence of warm, emotionally available, and consistently attuned caregivers. Our ancestors raised children collectively, providing infants with a rich tapestry of constant physical touch, immediate responsiveness to distress, and multiple layers of emotional support. The infant brain relies entirely on these external interactions to build its internal architecture. When a child experiences distress, they cannot soothe themselves. They depend on the calming presence of an adult to regulate their nervous system. Repeated experiences of being seen, understood, and comforted lay down the neural pathways for lifelong emotional resilience. Furthermore, children require the freedom to play in an unstructured environment, unburdened by the anxieties and expectations of the adult world. True play is the essential work of childhood, the crucible where creativity, problem-solving, and a secure sense of self are forged. However, in our modern configuration, these irreducible needs are systematically undermined. The village has been replaced by the isolated nuclear family, which is often stretched to the breaking point. Well-meaning parents, exhausted by economic pressures, lacking communal support, and carrying their own unhealed emotional wounds, find themselves physically present but emotionally depleted. A parent consumed by anxiety or depression cannot provide the steady emotional attunement an infant's developing brain desperately craves. This is not a failure of individual character, but a structural catastrophe. When the environment fails to provide the sturdy foundation of unconditional, relaxed emotional availability, the child's development is built on fragile, shaky ground, predisposing them to a lifetime of anxiety, emotional dysregulation, and physical vulnerability. Tragically, this distortion of human development begins long before a child takes their first breath. The womb is often romanticized as an impermeable sanctuary, entirely insulated from the harsh realities of the outside world. Yet the barrier between the mother and the developing fetus is highly porous, not just physically, but emotionally. The prenatal environment is the child's first encounter with the world, and it is entirely mediated by the mother's lived experience. When an expectant mother is supported, emotionally secure, and relatively free from chronic distress, the chemical signals passed to the fetus foster a calm, stable development. However, if the mother is subjected to the toxicities of modern life, whether it be the quiet despair of an unhappy relationship, the crushing burden of poverty, the trauma of systemic racism, or the relentless pressure of a demanding career, her body responds by flooding her system with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These chemicals readily cross the placenta, directly altering the developing architecture of the fetal brain and nervous system. The fetus, possessing an ancient biological intelligence, begins to adapt to the environment it anticipates entering. If the prenatal chemical environment signals danger, hostility, and chronic stress, the infant's nervous system is pre-wired for a state of constant alarm. They arrive at the threshold of life already braced for a threat, their baseline stress response set unnaturally high. This profoundly sensitive period of gestation demonstrates how deeply our societal structures reach into our biology. The anxieties of the culture are transmitted directly into the womb, ensuring that before a child has even encountered the external world, their physiological and emotional foundation has already been subtly and sometimes severely compromised by the unseen pressures of the world they are about to inherit. It is a profound paradox of our time that the very act of bringing forth life has been largely stripped of its emotional and spiritual gravity. In our quest for absolute safety and medical efficiency, childbirth has been fundamentally redesigned into a highly managed clinical procedure. We have come to treat the mother's body as a biological machine requiring continuous supervision and frequent intervention, prioritizing hospital schedules and risk mitigation over the deep primal needs of both mother and infant. This highly medicalized approach often isolates the birthing parent from the ancestral web of communal support, replacing intuitive, comforting presence with the sterile hum of machinery and the rigid rush of institutional protocols. The newborn's first impression of reality is thus shifted from a warm, deeply attuned reception to a jarring, clinical transition. Instead of entering an environment that honors the profound vulnerability of the moment, the infant is immediately introduced to a systemic detachment, setting an initial tone of separation. This systemic stripping of support continues long after the child leaves the delivery room, plunging caregivers into an impossibly barren landscape. Raising a human being requires an immense, continuous reservoir of emotional energy, patience, and stable presence, resources that simply cannot be generated in a vacuum. Yet, modern society expects parents to cultivate healthy, resilient children in virtual isolation, an endeavor akin to attempting delicate horticulture on the surface of the moon. Stripped of the extended family networks, elders, and tightly knit communities that characterized human history for millennia, today's parents are left profoundly undersupported and overwhelmed. They are crushed between the relentless demands of a hyper-competitive, time-scarce economy and the profound biological duty of nurturing their young. When caregivers are chronically stressed, financially insecure, or emotionally depleted, they cannot provide the steady, relaxing atmosphere that a developing nervous system desperately requires to feel secure. The resulting home environment is frequently one of quiet, pervasive anxiety, where children unconsciously absorb the unspoken tensions and exhaustion of the adults who anchor their world. In the absence of a stable, deeply connected adult anchor, the developing brain is inevitably forced in the wrong direction, A child's biological imperative for attachment does not simply vanish when the adults in their life are physically absent or emotionally preoccupied. Instead, that powerful drive aggressively seeks alternative targets. We are currently witnessing a tragic societal pivot where children increasingly turn to their peers to fulfill their deepest relational needs. This peer orientation is a catastrophic developmental shift. Immature, undeveloped peers are fundamentally incapable of providing the unconditional security and mature emotional regulation that a child requires to grow. Instead of resting safely in the care of a mature adult, the child must constantly work to maintain the fragile, superficial, and often highly conditional acceptance of their peer group. Compounding this developmental sabotage is the pervasive intrusion of digital environments and artificial stimuli, which hijack the brain's delicate reward circuitry and completely bypass the nuanced, face-to-face, empathetic interactions that are biologically essential for true emotional maturation. The culmination of these disrupted foundations is a society where early distress inevitably calcifies into what we mistakenly label as individual personality or character. We observe an adult who is chronically anxious, ruthlessly driven for status, deeply insecure or emotionally withdrawn, and we casually assume these traits are simply inherent components of their nature or genetic makeup. In truth, these are deeply ingrained survival strategies, a rigid template forged in the fires of an early environment that failed to meet their fundamental developmental needs. The culture provides the toxic mold, and the vulnerable child contorts themselves to fit it. This profound adaptation requires the severing of vital connections to one's own authentic, visceral needs, a tragic, unconscious bargain struck in early life in exchange for basic emotional or physical survival. We have constructed an entire modern civilization upon this very fracture, normalizing a collective distress and a widespread loss of self that now masquerades as the standard human condition. Rethinking abnormal, afflictions as adaptations. When the bedrock of human development is compromised by a society that routinely denies our deepest biological and emotional needs, the resulting pain cannot simply evaporate. It must go somewhere. It manifests in behaviors and psychological states that the medical establishment and society at large hastily label as abnormal. We look at severe psychological distress, compulsive self-destruction, and profound emotional instability, and we categorize these states as discrete pathologies, bizarre aberrations that have inexplicably invaded an otherwise healthy mind. Yet, this perspective is profoundly backward. To truly grasp the nature of human suffering, we must undergo a radical shift in perspective. We must begin to see these deeply stigmatized conditions not as random illnesses or moral failures, but as desperate, brilliantly constructed adaptations to an unlivable reality. Chapter 15. Just Not to Be You. Debunking the myths about addiction. Perhaps nowhere is this misunderstanding more tragic and pervasive than in our societal confrontation with addiction. The conventional wisdom surrounding addiction is built upon two towering contradictory myths. The first is the moral model, a punitive ideology that views the addict as a person of weak character, someone who has freely chosen a path of hedonistic destruction and simply refuses to exercise willpower. This belief fuels a disastrous war on drugs, criminalizing deep human suffering and responding to trauma with incarceration and shame. The second myth is the prevailing medical model, which attempts to remove the moral stigma by labeling addiction purely as a chronic brain disease, a genetic glitch that randomly hijacks the neural circuitry of an unfortunate few. Both paradigms miss the fundamental truth of the experience. Addiction is neither a choice nor a biological accident. It is at its core an attempt to solve a problem. The true nature of this problem is an unbearable, agonizing pain of simply being in one's own skin. Before we ask why the addiction exists, we must first ask, why the pain? The substance or the behavior is not the primary disease. It is the individual's frantic, improvised painkiller. It provides a fleeting, artificial moment of peace, a temporary sanctuary from the crushing weight of unresolved trauma, chronic anxiety, and profound inner emptiness. For a fleeting instant, the addict is granted permission not to be themselves. To strip away the substance without first addressing the excruciating internal landscape it is meant to soothe is an act of cruelty. We must stop asking what is wrong with the addicted person and start asking what happened to them that made reality so unbearable that they must risk their very lives to escape it. Chapter 16. Show of Hands. A New View of Addiction. If we accept that addiction is rooted in an attempt to escape pain and fill a void, we must dramatically expand our definition of where it resides. It is highly convenient for society to confine the concept of addiction to the margins, to the desperate individuals injecting heroin in dimly lit alleyways. This allows the rest of the culture to maintain a comfortable illusion of superiority. But the mechanics of addiction, the intense craving, the temporary relief, the damaging consequences, and the agonizing inability to stop despite those consequences, operate on a vast, universal continuum. Once we remove the narrow lens of illicit substances, a staggering reality comes into focus. Our entire economic and social machinery is deeply dependent upon and actively cultivates addictive behaviors. The frantic pursuit of wealth, the relentless hoarding of power, the insatiable hunger for status and prestige, these are profoundly addictive loops driven by the exact same internal emptiness and the same desperate need for external validation. We see it in the compulsive consumption of material goods, the obsessive engagement with digital screens, and the frantic need to control our relationships or our physical appearance. The socially celebrated executive who sacrifices their marriage, their health and their integrity to achieve endless corporate expansion is driven by the very same neurological imperatives as the street corner addict. The only difference lies in social acceptability and the destructive radius of the chosen coping mechanism. We are living in a culture that not only breeds the pain that necessitates addiction, but simultaneously profits off the endless, varied ways we try to numb it. Chapter 17. An inaccurate map of our pain. What we get wrong about mental illness. This same fundamental misreading of human suffering extends deep into the realm of mental health. Mainstream psychiatry relies heavily on complex manuals of diagnostic criteria, categorizing human despair into a vast array of distinct disorders. If you display a certain cluster of symptoms, persistent sadness, paralyzing worry, sudden shifts in mood, or an inability to focus, you are handed a specific label. These labels are often presented as definitive biological explanations. You are told you have depression or anxiety or ADHD, much in the way one might be diagnosed with diabetes or a broken bone. However, these psychiatric diagnoses are largely descriptive, not explanatory. They describe how a person is suffering, but they offer absolutely no insight into why. They provide an incredibly inaccurate map of human pain, one that artificially separates the distress of the mind from the lived experience of the individual. By reducing profound emotional despair to a mere chemical imbalance in the brain, we strip the suffering of its context and its meaning. When a person falls into a deep, paralyzing depression, it is often not a random biological malfunction, but a profound systemic shutdown. It is the psyche's ultimate defense mechanism against an overwhelming environment, a withdrawal from a life that feels fundamentally unsafe or profoundly misaligned with one's authentic nature. To merely medicate the symptom without interrogating the life that produced it is to silence the very alarm bell that might lead to true healing. Chapter 18. The mind can do some amazing things, from madness to meaning. Even in its most extreme and terrifying manifestations, the human mind operates with an underlying self-protective logic. Conditions categorized as severe mental illness, such as psychosis or schizophrenia, are often viewed as the ultimate breakdown of reason, a chaotic and meaningless plunge into darkness. The hallucinations, the paranoia, and the fractured realities seem entirely divorced from any comprehensible human experience. Yet, if we listen closely, with profound empathy rather than clinical detachment, a different narrative emerges. These extreme mental states are often the mind's final, desperate attempt to make sense of a reality that has been shattered by catastrophic trauma. When the external world is a source of unendurable terror or unspeakable abuse, the mind possesses the astonishing capacity to construct a new reality. The delusions and the voices are not random noise. They are deeply metaphorical narratives, distorted attempts to process and contain psychological agony that cannot be consciously borne. There is a profound, albeit fragmented, meaning hidden within the madness. The psyche, even when pushed to the absolute brink of disintegration, is still fiercely attempting to survive. Understanding this does not romanticize severe mental illness, which is an agonizing ordeal. Rather, it restores humanity to those who suffer from it. It demands that we look past the terrifying symptoms and recognize the deeply wounded, incredibly resilient human spirit desperately fighting for survival beneath the surface. The toxicities of our culture. To truly heal, we must expand our diagnostic gaze beyond the individual and scrutinize the environment in which the individual is forced to survive. We do not exist in a vacuum. We are highly porous creatures, continuously absorbing the atmospheric conditions of our society. When a staggering percentage of a population is chronically ill, anxious, or addicted, it is an act of profound denial to simply blame the defective biology or fragile psychology of the individuals. We must confront the reality that the culture itself is fundamentally toxic. This toxicity is not a metaphor, it is a measurable, physiological reality. The values, economic demands, and social structures that define modern civilization actively generate the very conditions that destroy human health, creating a pervasive environment of hostility that we have collectively normalized. Chapter 19. From Society to Cell. Uncertainty, conflict, and loss of control. The invisible forces of our culture do not merely influence our thoughts, they penetrate the very core of our biology, cascading from the macroscopic structures of society down to the microscopic architecture of our cells. The human nervous system is exceptionally sensitive to specific environmental triggers, the most potent of which are chronic uncertainty, unending conflict, and a profound loss of agency. In our ancestral past, acute stress was a temporary state, a brief physiological mobilization designed to escape immediate physical danger. Today, however, the threats are abstract, relentless, and embedded in the structure of daily life. The modern economy demands constant flexibility, stripping away job security, financial predictability, and communal safety nets. People are subjected to the grinding, low-grade terror of precarious living, constantly anticipating the next crisis while possessing very little actual power to alter their circumstances. This chronic lack of control is interpreted by the ancient mechanisms of the brain as a perpetual state of mortal peril. The body responds by continuously flooding the bloodstream with stress hormones, keeping the organism in a state of exhausting hypervigilance. Over time, this ceaseless alarm bell ceases to be a defense mechanism and becomes a weapon of self-destruction. The constant saturation of cortisol and adrenaline disrupts the immune system, accelerates the aging of our DNA by wearing down cellular telomeres, and ignites a slow-burning systemic inflammation throughout the body. The political and economic conflicts of the external world are thus translated into biological warfare within. The stress of poverty, the anxiety of marginalization, and the quiet despair of powerlessness are not merely psychological burdens. They are biological toxins, dismantling human health at the cellular level with terrifying efficiency. Chapter 20. Robbing the Human Spirit. Disconnection and its discontents. As our physical bodies bear the cellular brunt of societal stress, our inner lives are simultaneously subjected to a profound quiet starvation. We are living through an unprecedented epidemic of disconnection, a widespread severing of the vital, life-sustaining bonds that make us human. Modernity has engineered a civilization that is highly efficient, technologically miraculous, and deeply, fundamentally lonely. We have traded the deep, reciprocal roots of community for the shallow, fragmented interactions of the marketplace and the digital sphere. The modern individual is frequently untethered from extended family, alienated from the natural world, and isolated from meaningful participation in a cohesive community. This pervasive isolation is an assault on the human spirit. We are a tribal species, biologically mandated to find safety, meaning, and identity through our connections with others. When those connections are severed, the resulting void is not just a passing sadness. It is a profound existential crisis. It breeds a lingering, nameless anxiety, a sense of drifting through a meaningless void. To cope with this spiritual malnutrition, people desperately turn to artificial substitutes, seeking connection through the distorted mirrors of social media, or attempting to fill the inner emptiness with consumerism, status-seeking, or the numbing embrace of substances. Yet, these synthetic replacements provide no actual nourishment. They only deepen the alienation, trapping individuals in a cycle of endless craving and profound dissatisfaction. The human spirit, deprived of its essential relational diet, slowly withers, manifesting as the widespread depression, apathy, and despair that increasingly characterize modern life. Chapter 21. They just don't care if it kills you. Sociopathy as strategy. To understand how such a deeply hostile environment could become the normalized standard of living, we must examine the driving forces that architect our society. The dominant institutions of our time, massive multinational corporations, financial systems, and deeply entrenched political apparatuses, operate according to a set of rules that completely divorce power from empathy. If we were to analyze the behavior of these colossal entities using the diagnostic criteria we apply to individuals, we would be forced to conclude that they operate with clinical sociopathy. They are driven by a singular, ruthless mandate, the maximization of profit and the endless accumulation of power, completely untethered from any moral obligation or concern for the collateral damage inflicted upon human lives or the natural world. This sociopathic strategy is deeply embedded in the very industries meant to sustain us. The food industry engineers highly addictive, nutritionally barren products that drive a global metabolic crisis, fully aware of the devastating health consequences. Social media conglomerates design algorithms that deliberately hijack the vulnerable reward circuitry of the brain, prioritizing endless engagement and outrage over the psychological safety of a generation. The pharmaceutical and medical industries often prioritize the management of chronic symptoms over the pursuit of genuine healing, capitalizing on the unending stream of illness generated by the culture. These entities do not necessarily possess a malicious desire to cause harm. Rather, they possess a chilling, absolute indifference to it. They simply do not care if their pursuit of endless growth kills the host. We are living within a highly organized system that views human well-being not as a fundamental right, but as a completely irrelevant variable in the pursuit of economic dominance, leaving the individual to navigate a world that is fundamentally indifferent to their survival. Chapter 22. The Assaulted Sense of Self. How race and class get under the skin. The structural inequalities that divide our society do not merely determine an individual's access to material wealth or social mobility. They dictate the very physiological burden an individual is forced to carry. To be positioned at the lower rungs of the socio-economic ladder or to belong to a racially marginalized group is to be subjected to a relentless, invisible weathering process. The indignities of prejudice, the daily microaggressions, and the constant suffocating anxiety of financial insecurity are not just psychological hardships, they are biological events. Every glance of suspicion, every institutional barrier, and every moment of profound disrespect is translated by the nervous system into a potent cascade of stress hormones. This chronic activation of the body's defense mechanisms is meant to be a temporary shield, not a lifelong state of being. When an individual is forced to navigate a society that implicitly or explicitly devalues their existence, their physiological alarm systems can never truly turn off. The body must constantly expend vital energy anticipating the next threat, a phenomenon deeply understood as allostatic load, the cumulative wear and tear on the biological systems. Over decades, this relentless internal vigilance silently damages the cardiovascular system, exhausts the immune response, and accelerates cellular aging. The tragic disparities we see in life expectancy, maternal mortality rates, and the prevalence of chronic diseases across different racial and economic lines are not the result of inherent biological flaws. They are the stark, measurable physical evidence of social injustice. The hierarchy of our culture is literally carved into the biology of those who are oppressed by it, proving that racism and poverty are not just social issues, but profound public health crises. Chapter 23. Society's Shock Absorbers. Why Women Have It Worse. Within this complex matrix of societal stresses, the burden of emotional labor is distributed with profound inequality. The prevailing culture fundamentally relies on the chronic self-suppression of women to maintain its fragile equilibrium. From their earliest years, women are subjected to a rigorous, unspoken conditioning that equates their ultimate value with their capacity to nurture, accommodate, and absorb the distress of those around them. They are implicitly trained to prioritize the needs, comfort, and emotional stability of their families and communities over their own authentic boundaries. The socially acceptable archetype of the good woman is one who endlessly sacrifices her own vitality, silently swallowing her justifiable anger and repressing her own exhaustion to keep the peace. This monumental emotional labor renders women the invisible shock absorbers of society, cushioning the blows of a harsh world for everyone else. However, this systemic expectation of endless accommodation demands a terrible physiological toll. When the conscious mind is culturally forbidden from setting limits, and when the word no is treated as an act of aggressive selfishness, the body eventually assumes the responsibility of refusal. The staggering disproportionate rate at which women are afflicted by autoimmune conditions, chronic fatigue, and mysterious pain syndromes is not a mysterious quirk of female biology. It is the fierce internal rebellion of an organism that has been pushed beyond its limits. The immune system, confused by the lifelong blurring of boundaries between the self and the needs of others, begins to attack the very body it was designed to protect. The epidemic of chronic illness among women is the physical manifestation of a culture that demands they endlessly care for others while systematically denying them the right to care for themselves. Chapter 24. We feel their pain. Our trauma-infused politics. The unhealed wounds of our individual pasts do not remain neatly confined within our private lives. They inevitably bleed out into the public square, profoundly shaping the landscape of our collective governance. Politics, ideally the rational administration of a society's shared resources, is in reality a highly volatile theater of human emotion. The political arena operates as a massive, unconscious projection screen where populations play out their deepest unresolved traumas, their primal fears, and their desperate need for security. When a society is saturated with chronic stress, isolation, and a pervasive sense of powerlessness, the collective nervous system is primed for reactivity. In this state of societal hypervigilance, populations become immensely vulnerable to political figures who instinctively exploit these underlying emotional fractures. Leaders who operate from a place of grandiosity, absolute certainty, and aggressive division are rarely acting from genuine strength. More often, they are acting out their own profound early wounds on a global stage. Yet to an anxious, traumatized populace, this unyielding rigidity can masquerade as a desperate form of safety. We mistakenly empower figures who promise simple, aggressive solutions to complex anxieties, unconsciously seeking the formidable, protective parental figure that our stressed society so deeply craves. The hostilities we witness in modern political discourse, the vicious tribalism, the inability to empathize with opposing viewpoints, and the readiness to demonize the other are the exact societal equivalents of an individual's trauma responses. We cannot hope to heal our broken political systems through logical debate alone. We must recognize that the venom in our politics is a direct reflection of the unacknowledged pain in our populace. The journey through the darkest landscapes of our cultural toxicities and personal traumas is not meant to end in despair. Recognizing the depth of the fracture is the terrifying but necessary prerequisite for true restoration. We arrive now at the threshold of possibility, moving from the grim diagnosis of our collective suffering to the active, deliberate pursuit of wholeness. It is essential first to redefine what we mean by healing. Healing is not a forceful eradication of symptoms, nor is it a magical return to a pristine, unblemished state of perfection that existed prior to our pain. Rather, the word itself shares its ancient linguistic roots with the concept of being whole. To heal is to embark on a profound journey of recovery, literally recovering the lost, fragmented pieces of our authentic selves that we were forced to abandon in the desperate pursuit of early survival. In this delicate, ongoing process of reintegration, the conscious mind must step forward as the lead navigator. For years, perhaps decades, the traumatized nervous system has unilaterally dictated our reactions, keeping us trapped in rigid physiological loops of defensiveness, withdrawal, and fear. However, human biology is graced with an astonishing inherent plasticity. The brain is not a static, rigidly wired machine doomed to endlessly repeat the past. It is a dynamic, living ecosystem capable of profound remodeling. By consciously engaging our awareness, we can actively begin to lay down new neural pathways. This requires a deliberate, courageous turning inward. When we allow the observing mind to gently witness our painful automatic patterns without immediate identification or harsh judgment, we create a vital, microscopic space between stimulus and response. In that newfound space, the automatic, suffocating grip of history begins to loosen, and the possibility of genuine, self-directed change finally emerges. To navigate this highly sensitive inner terrain, we must consciously cultivate a specific set of foundational principles, internal postures that actively counteract the rigid defenses we erected long ago. The first of these is an unwavering daily commitment to authenticity, a slow, deliberate practice of tuning back into our visceral truths and honoring them even when they threaten to disrupt the comfortable expectations of those around us. Alongside authenticity, we must reclaim our agency. This means stepping firmly out of the paralyzing role of the helpless victim of our circumstances and assuming total responsibility for our own conscious responses to the present world. Furthermore, we must learn to welcome the deeply misunderstood and heavily stigmatized energy of healthy anger. Unlike the destructive, explosive rage born of unhealed wounds, true, healthy anger is a vital, protective biological force, a clear, undeniable boundary that simply states, "This is my limit, and you shall not cross it." Finally, this entire process must rest upon a bedrock of radical acceptance. This does not imply a passive, defeated resignation to abuse or suffering, but rather a clear-eyed, undefensive acknowledgement of reality exactly as it is in the present moment, refusing to exhaust our precious life force fighting against the undeniable truth of our own history. These rigorous principles must simultaneously be bathed in a profound, multifaceted compassion. Our culture systematically trains us to be our own harshest, most unforgiving critics, but true healing demands that we approach our deepest flaws and most destructive habits with a radical tenderness. We must develop deep compassion for our own suffering, recognizing it as a perfectly natural response to profoundly unnatural conditions. We must extend this same compassion to our protective mechanisms, understanding that even our most toxic, self-destructive behaviors were once brilliant, desperate attempts by a vulnerable child to keep us safe. As we soften toward ourselves, we inevitably cultivate a broader, systemic compassion, recognizing the heavy, invisible burdens carried by everyone around us. We may even find the capacity to extend a difficult, highly nuanced empathy toward those who have caused us harm, understanding that their transgressions were almost certainly born of their own unhealed fractures and inherited pain. As we slowly integrate these principles, a radical shift in perspective becomes possible, particularly regarding our physical and psychological afflictions. We are deeply conditioned to view illness, whether it be a severe autoimmune flare-up, a crippling depressive episode, or a life-threatening diagnosis, as a malicious, invading enemy that must be aggressively battled and mercilessly destroyed. This militaristic approach often alienates us even further from our own struggling bodies. However, a profound transformation occurs when we dare to view the disease not merely as a meaningless catastrophe, but as a dreadful, urgent gift. When the body stages a desperate mutiny, finally refusing to carry the suffocating burden of chronic stress and emotional suppression any longer, it is sending a fierce message that the conscious mind has stubbornly refused to hear. The illness forces a sudden, absolute halt to an unsustainable way of living. It violently strips away our superficial obligations and demands our undivided, immediate attention. In its devastating wake, an affliction often burns away the false illusions of who we thought we were supposed to be, leaving behind only what is absolutely, undeniably essential. By listening closely to the desperate, metaphorical language of the symptom, we can often decode the specific boundaries we have violated and the authentic needs we have chronically ignored. While no one in their right mind actively invites disease, Many who endure the crucible of severe illness eventually recognize it as the fierce, unforgiving teacher that finally compelled them to change their lives, breaking their rigid shells open so that the process of true, authentic wholeness could finally begin. Chapter 28. Before the Body Says No. First steps on the return to self. The profound crisis of severe illness often forces a necessary reckoning, but we do not have to wait for an absolute physical or psychological collapse to begin the journey of reclamation. The body is constantly speaking to us, long before it is forced to scream. It communicates through a subtle, continuous language of physical sensations, quiet intuitions, and gut feelings, a vital stream of biological intelligence that we have been rigorously trained to ignore. To embark on the return to the authentic self is, first and foremost, a practice of relearning how to listen. This requires us to intentionally reverse the lifelong habit of self-abandonment. When we feel a sudden tightening in our chest before agreeing to a project we do not have the energy for, or a heavy sinking in our stomach when crossing our own boundaries to appease another, we must stop dismissing these signals as inconvenient noise. These are the ancient protective mechanisms of the organism attempting to guide us away from harm. The initial steps toward wholeness involve creating deliberate, quiet pauses in our frantic daily rhythms. In these pauses, we must shift our attention away from the relentless demands of the external world and direct it entirely inward, mapping our internal landscape without judgment. This practice is not about achieving a state of blissful relaxation. Rather, it is about developing a sturdy capacity to sit with whatever discomfort arises. By tuning into the physical manifestations of our stress, the clenched jaw, the shallow breathing, the persistent fatigue, we begin to dismantle the thick walls of numbness that have separated us from our true needs. We transition from a state of mindless reactivity where our wounded nervous system automatically dictates our choices to a state of conscious inquiry. We ask ourselves what we are actually feeling in this very moment and what those feelings are attempting to protect. In doing so, we slowly rebuild the crucial bridge between our conscious awareness and our physical existence, allowing us to heed the warnings of our biology long before the body is forced to say a devastating final no. Chapter 29. Seeing is disbelieving, undoing self-limiting beliefs. As we reconnect with our physical sensations, we inevitably encounter the rigid psychological architecture that keeps our trauma in place. Our minds are narrative engines, constantly weaving complex stories to make sense of our early experiences. When a child endures emotional deprivation or chronic stress, the mind constructs powerful, generalized rules about how the world works and what must be done to survive within it. These early adaptations calcify into deeply held, unconscious beliefs. The belief that one is fundamentally flawed and unlovable, the conviction that the world is inherently hostile, or the unyielding rule that one's worth is entirely dependent on relentless productivity and extreme self-sacrifice. These convictions are completely invisible to us because they do not feel like beliefs. They feel like the absolute, objective truth of reality. They form the invisible lens through which we interpret every interaction, effectively ensuring that we endlessly recreate the very dynamics that originally wounded us. To heal, we must engage in the radical act of seeing these convictions for what they truly are, artifacts of a painful past, not accurate descriptions of the present. This requires a rigorous, courageous process of self-interrogation. We must learn to catch ourselves in the moment of a triggered reaction and actively question the deeply seated assumption driving it. When the familiar internal voice insists that a minor failure means we are utterly worthless, we must step back and recognize that voice not as our authentic self, but as a terrified echo from childhood. By continuously shining the light of conscious awareness on these unquestioned narratives, we strip them of their absolute authority. We learn that seeing these deeply ingrained illusions clearly is the first crucial step to disbelieving them, opening up entirely new, uncharted possibilities for how we might exist in the world. Chapter 30. Foes to Friends. Working with the obstacles to healing. The path towards self-reclamation is rarely a linear progression of unburdening. It is almost always met with fierce, baffling internal resistance. As we begin to dismantle our lifelong coping mechanisms, we inevitably encounter profound obstacles. Sudden waves of inexplicable anxiety, an overwhelming urge to return to old, destructive habits, or a paralyzing fear of change. The instinctive reaction is to view this resistance as an enemy, a frustrating failure of willpower, or a sign that we are somehow broken beyond repair. We attempt to aggressively battle our own hesitation, violently forcing ourselves forward. However, this combative approach only reinforces the internal war that caused our suffering in the first place. True healing demands a complete paradigm shift in how we relate to our own resistance. We must recognize that the parts of us that are terrified of change are not our foes. They are deeply devoted, albeit misguided, protectors. The psychological defenses that block our progress were constructed to shield a highly vulnerable child from unendurable pain. To suddenly tear down those walls feels, to the nervous system, like an invitation to immediate annihilation. Therefore, instead of attacking our resistance, we must learn to befriend it. We must approach our self-sabotage, our fears, and our regressions with immense curiosity and profound respect. By gently asking our internal obstacles what they are so desperately trying to protect us from, we de-escalate the internal conflict. We reassure the terrified, protective parts of our psyche that while their defenses were necessary in the past, they are no longer required for survival in the present. When we transform our internal foes into understood allies, the resistance naturally softens, and the energy that was once bound up in endless self-protection is finally liberated for genuine growth.
Chapter 31. Jesus in the Teepee, Psychedelics and Healing. As we push the boundaries of conventional trauma treatment, we inevitably arrive at the frontier where ancient ancestral wisdom intersects with modern psychological despair. In recent years, there has been a profound resurgence of interest in the therapeutic potential of psychedelic compounds and sacred plant medicines. In a culture desperately searching for a quick fix, it is incredibly easy to misunderstand these powerful substances, viewing them either as dangerous recreational escapes or as miraculous instantaneous cures. They are neither. When approached with profound reverence in a safe, deeply supported ceremonial or clinical context, these substances serve as powerful catalysts for breaking down the rigid, calcified architecture of the traumatized mind. The human ego, heavily fortified by decades of protective defenses and limiting beliefs, operates as a strict, unyielding gatekeeper. It continuously filters our perception of reality, ensuring that we remain safely within the narrow, familiar confines of our historical pain. Psychedelics possess the astonishing capacity to temporarily bypass this gatekeeper. They dissolve the heavy, suffocating illusion of separation, plunging the individual into the submerged, often terrifying depths of their own psyche. In this expanded state of consciousness, people frequently encounter the raw, unedited truth of their earliest psychic wounds, stripped of their usual emotional numbness. Yet this harrowing confrontation with one's own pain is paradoxically accompanied by an overwhelming visceral experience of universal love and profound interconnectedness. The individual is granted a fleeting, breathtaking glimpse of their true, undamaged essence, the radiant, indestructible self that has always existed beneath the scarred layers of trauma. However, it is paramount to understand that the medicine itself does not do the healing. It simply opens a heavily guarded door, illuminating the landscape that must be traversed. The profound visions and intense emotional releases experienced in the altered state are merely the prologue. The actual, gritty work of healing lies in the rigorous daily integration of these profound revelations into the mundane, often difficult reality of ordinary life. Without dedicated integration, the visionary experience fades into a distant memory. With it, the experience becomes the foundation for a profoundly transformed existence. Chapter 32. My Life as a Genuine Thing. Touching Spirit. This profound process of stripping away the false layers of the conditioned self inevitably transcends the boundaries of the physical body and the mechanical mind, carrying us to the threshold of the spiritual. In a modern society overwhelmingly dominated by a harsh, reductionist materialism, the very concept of spirit is frequently met with deep cynicism. It is often dismissed as unscientific sentimentality or tragically co-opted by rigid, dogmatic institutions that use the concept of the divine to exert control and instill fear. But true spirituality bears no resemblance to rigid belief systems or compulsory rituals.
It is, at its core, an intimate, visceral experience of profound belonging. To touch spirit is to experience the sudden, quiet realization that the universe is not a dead, indifferent void, but a deeply interconnected web of living meaning, of which we are an integral, necessary part. When the heavy burdens of early trauma and the frantic, exhausting demands of societal conditioning are finally laid down, what remains at our core is not an empty, terrifying void. What remains is a quiet, vibrant presence. It is the realization that one's own authentic life is a genuinely sacred phenomenon. This spiritual awakening is the ultimate antidote to the pervasive, soul-crushing alienation of the modern age. When an individual finally learns to rest in this profound, inherent connection, the desperate, lifelong search for external validation simply ceases. The frantic need to prove one's worth through endless achievement, accumulation, or the appeasement of others is replaced by a deep, unshakable resting in one's own inherent, undeniable dignity. It is the return home to the self that we never truly lost, but simply forgot how to find. Chapter 33. Unmaking a Myth, Visioning a Saner Society. Yet, this monumental task of individual reclamation cannot occur in a vacuum, nor can it serve as the final destination of our journey. A genuinely awakened individual inevitably recognizes that their personal suffering is inextricably interwoven with the collective agony of the culture. We cannot achieve true, lasting wholeness while continuing to swim in a deeply poisoned river. The ultimate purpose of peeling back our own defenses, of enduring the grueling process of integrating our trauma, is to generate the absolute clarity and the fierce, uncompromising compassion necessary to challenge the fundamental structures of the society that wounded us in the first place. We must actively and courageously set about the work of unmaking the myth of normal. This requires a profound, systemic reimagining of our world. It demands a radical shift away from institutions built upon ruthless competition, the cynical exploitation of human vulnerabilities, and the outright denial of our fundamental biological and emotional needs. We must dare to envision and then actively construct a civilization that honors the profound, delicate sensitivity of childhood. We must demand economic and social structures that deeply support the exhaustive, sacred labor of caregiving rather than penalizing it. We must prioritize genuine human flourishing, deep communal connection, and profound respect for the natural world over the sociopathic, endless accumulation of corporate power and material wealth. This vision of a saner, trauma-informed society is not a naive utopian fantasy. It is an absolute biological imperative for the survival and continued evolution of our species. The dominant culture has pushed human resilience to its absolute breaking point, manifesting as a global crisis of chronic illness, mental anguish, and profound planetary destruction. The work of healing begins within the quiet, courageous reclamation of our own individual minds and bodies. But it must inevitably expand outward. Our healed pain must be transformed into a radical, unstoppable demand for a world where the human spirit is no longer required to numb itself to survive. A world where every individual has the space, the safety, and the unalienable right to finally, truly breathe.